Chapter 1. 2 Alphas, 1 Room. The restaurant was warm, buzzing with quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses. Luka sat stiffly beside Noah, his best friend, trying not to look too irritated. He wasn't one for social gatherings, especially not ones that forced him to meet new people. Across the table, Ethan beamed, introducing his closest friend, Adrian. "Adrian, this is Luka," Ethan said cheerfully. "Luka, meet Adrian. He's practically my brother." Luka turned his gaze to the man sitting across from him, and immediately wished he hadn't. Adrian's presence was like a storm contained in human form, sharp eyes gleaming under the dim restaurant lights. Luka stiffened, their hands clasping in a firm handshake. "Neither let go first." Adrian arched a brow. "You got a strong grip." Luka smirked slightly. "So do you." The handshake lingered, a silent test of wills. Noah cleared his throat. "Okay, enough of the alpha posturing. We came here to eat, not wrestle." Luka released Adrian's hand first, but the damage was already done. There was something in Adrian's stare that made his skin heat, something that set his instincts on edge. Chapter 2. A challenge in every word. "You're an architect?" Adrian leaned back in his seat, studying Luka with a lopsided grin. "Didn't take you for the designing type. Thought you'd be more of the punch first, ask questions later type." Luka rolled his eyes, sipping his drink. "And what exactly does an architect look like?" Adrian shrugged. "Not you." Noah and Ethan exchanged amused glances. The energy between Luka and Adrian was like a coiled spring, taut, ready to snap. Luka tilted his head, voice smooth. "And you? What do you do besides making assumptions about people you just met?" Adrian smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Law enforcement. I specialize in alpha-related cases." "Of course you do," Luka muttered. Adrian's lips twitched. "Something wrong with that?" Luka leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "Just funny how you analyze others when you barely know them." Adrian held his gaze. "I know enough." Luka's fingers clenched his glass. He wasn't sure if he was irritated or intrigued, but he didn't like the way Adrian looked at him, like he was something to figure out. Chapter 3. The first unspoken admission. The night had stretched on, and soon, it was just the 4 of them sitting in the dimly lit lounge area of the restaurant. Noah and Ethan were deep in conversation, but Luka was too aware of the presence beside him. "I think you like arguing with me," Adrian said suddenly, voice low. Luka scoffed. "I think you like provoking me." "Maybe." Adrian's fingers tapped against the table. "It's entertaining." Luka turned to face him fully. "You do this with everyone, or just me?" Adrian's lips curled in a way that made Luka's stomach tighten. "Just you." Something shifted in the air between them, unspoken, dangerous. Luka looked away, ignoring the way his pulse had quickened. Chapter 4. A test of willpower. The night air was crisp when they stepped outside, saying their goodbyes. Luka was about to walk off when a hand grabbed his wrist. He turned sharply. Adrian stood too close, his grip firm but not forceful. "You feel it too, don't you?" Adrian's voice was calm, but his eyes burned. Luka inhaled sharply, tugging his wrist free. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adrian's gaze didn't waver. "Liar." Luka clenched his jaw. "Whatever game you're playing, I'm not interested." Adrian leaned in just slightly, voice almost teasing. "Who said it was a game?" Luka's breath caught. He took a step back, then another. "Good night, Adrian." He turned and walked away, ignoring the heat crawling up his spine. Chapter 5. Crossing the line. Luka was restless that night. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was Adrian. His piercing gaze, the way he leaned in, the challenge in his voice. The next day, fate wasn't on his side. He ran into Adrian at a cafe near his office, as if the universe wanted to torment him. "You following me now?" Luka muttered, settling into his seat. Adrian chuckled. "Relax, I just like good coffee." Luka narrowed his eyes. "So it's a coincidence." Adrian smirked. Sure. Luka sighed, rubbing his temple. You're exhausting. Adrian leaned forward, voice softer this time. You should stop fighting this. Luka stiffened. There is no this. Adrian studied him for a long moment, then reached out. His fingers brushed over Luka's wrist. Light, barely a touch, but enough to make Luka's breath hitch. Tell me to stop, Adrian murmured. Luka opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Adrian's fingers ghosted up his arm, slow and deliberate. Luka's pulse pounded in his ears. You're insane, Luka finally whispered. Adrian smiled. Maybe. But so are you for still sitting here. Luka exhaled sharply. He should get up. He should walk away. But he didn't. Chapter 6. Breaking the First Barrier. Luka wasn't sure why he stayed. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Adrian. But he didn't move. Instead, he let Adrian's fingers trail over his skin, a touch that was light yet unbearably heavy. You're playing a dangerous game, Luka muttered, staring at Adrian's hand on his wrist. Adrian's gaze softened just slightly. Then stop me. Luka swallowed hard. He wanted to say something sharp, something to regain control of the moment, but his mind was blank. Instead, Adrian's thumb brushed over his pulse, slow, deliberate. Luka exhaled shakily. Adrian leaned in just a fraction, his breath warm against Luka's skin. You feel it, he murmured. You're just scared to admit it. Luka jerked his hand away, his chest rising and falling unevenly. I don't, his voice cracked, and he hated it. I don't have time for this. Adrian didn't stop him this time as he stood, grabbing his coat with more force than necessary. Then run, Adrian said simply, watching him with unreadable eyes. But you'll come back. Luka stormed out of the cafe, his heart pounding. Chapter 7. The Unavoidable Pull. Avoiding Adrian was impossible. No matter how hard Luka tried, their paths kept crossing. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Then, he realized it wasn't. You know, for someone who claims they're not interested, you sure keep showing up, Adrian teased when they ran into each other at a bar 3 days later. Luka clenched his jaw. It's a small city. Adrian smirked. Sure it is. Luka ignored him, downing his drink. He was here to unwind, not to deal with this unbearable man. But then, Adrian moved closer, their shoulders brushing, and Luka nearly choked. Relax, Adrian murmured, his voice low, intimate. I don't bite. Luka scoffed, gripping his glass tighter. I doubt that. Adrian chuckled, leaning in just enough for Luka to feel his breath against his ear. You're right. But only if they ask nicely. Luka turned sharply, eyes flashing. You're insufferable. Adrian only smiled. And you love it. Luka didn't deny it. Chapter 8. A Moment Too Close. It was raining when Luka left the bar. He hadn't expected Adrian to follow him. At least let me drive you home, Adrian said, shaking out his wet hair. Luka scoffed. I can handle myself. Yeah, I'm sure the rain respects that, Adrian said dryly. Luka glared at him, but before he could respond, Adrian reached out, grabbing his wrist again, always his wrist. Luka stiffened. Just get in the damn car, Adrian murmured, voice softer now, no teasing. Just something else. Something that made Luka's resolve weaken. For once, Luka didn't fight. The drive was silent, the air thick with tension. Adrian's fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his knuckles occasionally tightening as if he was holding something back. Luka stole glances at him, hating the way his chest ached with something unnamed. Stop looking at me like that, Adrian said suddenly. Luka's breath caught. Like what? Adrian's fingers clenched. Like you're trying to convince yourself of something. Luka looked away. Chapter 9. The First Real Touch. They made it to Luka's apartment, but neither moved. The rain pounded against the windshield, the only sound between them. You don't have to run from this, Adrian finally said, his voice quiet. Luka swallowed, fingers tightening around his seatbelt. "You don't understand." "Then help me." Luka turned to him, frustrated. "You make it sound so simple. Like this doesn't come with consequences." Adrian exhaled, his jaw tight. "Maybe it does. But that doesn't mean we should pretend it's not happening." Silence. Then Luka reached out, hesitant, unsure. His fingers brushed against Adrian's hand, testing, waiting. Adrian didn't move away. Instead, he turned his palm, letting Luka's fingers slide against his own. It was the first real touch that Luka initiated. The first time he admitted, without words, that he wasn't as unaffected as he wanted to be. Adrian lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips against Luka's knuckles. It was slow, reverent. Luka's breath shuddered. "You don't have to say anything," Adrian murmured. "Just don't pull away." Luka didn't. Chapter 10. The Line Between Want and Need. Luka knew it was a mistake to invite Adrian inside. But he did it anyway. The moment the door shut behind them, the air changed. "You don't have to do this," Adrian said, but he was already moving closer, his voice thick with restraint. Luka stared at him, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted. Adrian inhaled sharply. Then he closed the distance, his hands resting against Luka's arms, thumbs tracing slow circles. "Then don't." Luka's heart slammed against his ribs. Adrian's touch burned, sent heat curling in his stomach. He wanted more. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling. Adrian's hands slid up, fingers threading into Luka's hair. Luka's fingers gripped Adrian's shirt, clinging to him like he was the only steady thing in the room. "I hate you," Luka whispered, his voice shaking. Adrian laughed softly. "Liar." Luka exhaled sharply. Then, without thinking, he surged forward, his lips crashing against Adrian's in a desperate, searing kiss. Adrian didn't hesitate. He caught Luka by the waist, pressing him against the wall, their bodies flush. Luka gasped against his lips, the sound swallowed by Adrian's deep, satisfied hum. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was raw, consuming. A collision of emotions, of frustration and desire tangled into one. When they finally pulled apart, Luka was breathless, his fingers still tangled in Adrian's shirt. Adrian's forehead rested against his, both of them panting, stunned. Adrian chuckled, voice rough. "You're really bad at pretending you don't want this." Luka didn't argue. Chapter 11. The Denial Game. Luka barely slept. His mind replayed the kiss in an endless loop, and every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel Adrian, his warmth, his hands, the way he didn't hesitate to pull him closer. Morning light streamed through the window when Luka finally sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. Adrian was still asleep on the couch, his chest rising and falling evenly. Luka exhaled sharply. This was a mistake. He stood quietly, moving toward the door, but the moment his fingers brushed the knob, Adrian's voice cut through the silence. "Running again?" Luka stiffened, but he didn't turn around. "It's not running. It's thinking clearly." Adrian sighed, sitting up. "If that's what you need to tell yourself." Luka clenched his fists. "This, whatever this is, it won't work." Adrian didn't look angry, just tired. "You keep saying that, but you never leave." Luka swallowed hard, fighting the weight in his chest. "Because I don't know how." Adrian stood, slowly making his way over. "Then maybe it's time to stop pretending." Luka hated how much he wanted to believe him. Chapter 12. A Push and a Pull. Adrian didn't force Luka to stay, but he also didn't let him disappear. Over the next few days, they texted, small, meaningless messages that meant everything. Luka told himself it was fine, that keeping Adrian at arm's length was enough. Until it wasn't. "You overthink too much," Adrian said one evening as they sat on a park bench, shoulders brushing. Luka scoffed. "And you don't think enough." Adrian smirked. "Maybe that's why we work." Luka hated that his chest warmed at the thought. "We don't work." Adrian turned to him, gaze piercing. Then why are you here? Luka opened his mouth. Closed it. He didn't have an answer. Adrian reached out, fingers brushing Luka's wrist, always his wrist. It was starting to feel like a silent plea. You keep showing up, Luka. You keep letting me in. Just admit it already. Luka's throat tightened. I'm scared. Adrian's expression softened. Me too. But I'm still here. Luka exhaled shakily, and for once, he let himself lean into it. Chapter 13. A Dangerous Comfort. Falling into a pattern with Adrian was terrifyingly easy. They weren't together, not officially. But the way Adrian would pull Luka against him on the couch, the way his fingers always found a way to thread into Luka's hair, it was something. One night, Luka found himself cooking at Adrian's place. It felt normal. Domestic. You know, Adrian said as he leaned against the counter, watching him. You look good in my kitchen. Luka rolled his eyes. Flattery won't make me cook faster. Adrian smirked. Who said I was in a hurry? Luka tried to focus on the food, but he could feel Adrian's eyes on him, burning, knowing. It made his hands shake slightly as he plated the dish. You're impossible, Luka muttered, turning to hand him a plate. Adrian set it aside. Then, before Luka could react, he tugged him forward by the waist, pulling him between his legs. Luka gasped softly, hands instinctively bracing against Adrian's chest. Adrian's fingers curled around his hips, his voice quiet. Tell me to stop. Luka's breath hitched. He couldn't. Adrian's lips brushed against his temple, then his jaw. Luka's fingers curled into Adrian's shirt, his heart pounding. I'm falling, Luka whispered. Adrian exhaled against his skin. Then let me catch you. And for the first time, Luka let himself believe he could. Chapter 14. The Weight of Reality. Luka should have known it wouldn't last. One moment, he was basking in Adrian's warmth, his touches, his endless teasing. The next, he was reminded why they were doomed from the start. You're seeing him again, aren't you? Luka's best friend, Sam, asked, crossing his arms. Luka's stomach twisted. It's not like that, Sam scoffed. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you're falling for him. Luka swallowed hard. It's complicated. Sam's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. It doesn't have to be. You deserve something real, Luka. Not just stolen moments in the dark. Luka didn't know how to explain that Adrian was real. That what they had was more than just fleeting touches and whispered confessions. But he also couldn't ignore the truth. This wouldn't be easy. You're not the only one in this, you know, Sam said gently. What happens when it's not enough? Luka didn't have an answer. Chapter 15. Falling Too Fast. Luka tried to pull away. He really did. But Adrian noticed. You're avoiding me, Adrian said, arms crossed as he leaned against Luka's apartment door. Luka sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not. Adrian scoffed. Luka, you're a terrible liar. Luka exhaled sharply. I don't know what we're doing. Adrian's eyes darkened. You don't know, or you're scared to admit it. Luka's chest ached. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Adrian was in front of him, gripping his chin gently, tilting his head up. Tell me you don't want this, Adrian murmured. Tell me you don't think about me when I'm not around. Tell me you don't feel this. Luka's breath hitched. Adrian's thumb brushed over his lower lip, and Luka shuddered. I can't keep chasing you forever, Luka. Luka's heart clenched. He knew Adrian was right. So, instead of running, he did the only thing he could. He closed the distance, pressing his lips to Adrian's in a kiss that was desperate, consuming, real. Adrian groaned against his mouth, his arms wrapping tightly around Luka's waist, pulling him closer. Luka melted into it, gripping Adrian's shirt as if letting go wasn't an option. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against Luka's, their breaths mingling. No more running, Adrian whispered. Luka closed his eyes. No more running. And this time, he meant it. Chapter 16. The Unraveling Thread. Luka barely managed to hold himself together as Adrian's presence loomed over him. He felt it, the pull, the undeniable force that kept them tethered, even when Luka wanted to pull away. Can we stop pretending this isn't happening? Adrian's voice cut through Luka's thoughts, his hands resting lightly on Luka's hips. Luka's pulse quickened, but he fought the urge to melt into Adrian's touch. I don't know how to make it stop. Adrian took a step closer, his lips grazing Luka's ear. You don't have to. But I'm not letting you go this time. Luka's breath caught in his throat. Every word Adrian spoke sent a ripple of heat through his body, and he couldn't tell if it was the connection or the fear that made him shiver. What are we doing, Adrian? Luka whispered, his voice barely audible. Adrian leaned back, looking at him with an intensity that made Luka's knees weak. We're figuring it out. Together. But Luka wasn't sure he was ready for together. Not when everything around them seemed so fragile. Chapter 17. Fractured Minds, Unbroken Hearts. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, each moment with Adrian feeling like both a blessing and a curse. Luka couldn't focus, couldn't sleep. Everywhere he went, his mind drifted back to Adrian. They met again, at the same cafe where everything started. Adrian sat there, waiting for Luka as if he'd known all along that Luka would be there. I can't stop thinking about you, Luka confessed, sitting down across from Adrian. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Adrian's gaze softened. I think about you all the time. Luka's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. That's dangerous, you know. Adrian chuckled, his fingers brushing Luka's hand across the table. Maybe I'm dangerous, too. Luka's breath caught at the touch. His heart pounded as he leaned forward. You're impossible. Maybe, Adrian said softly, his hand lingering over Luka's, fingertips lightly grazing his palm. But I'm also real. Luka looked into Adrian's eyes, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to run. Chapter 18. The Slow Burn. Luka's walls were coming down, piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. He was trying to hold on to the remnants of his past, but Adrian was like a flame, burning through his defenses with every smile, every touch, every word. One evening, Adrian invited him to a gathering at his place. Just some friends, nothing too serious. Luka tried to convince himself it was a bad idea, but he found himself at Adrian's door, heart racing. Adrian opened it with that same easy smile, the one that always made Luka's chest tighten. You came. Against my better judgment, Luka replied, stepping inside. The laughter and chatter of the gathering felt distant as Adrian led Luka to a quieter corner of the room. There was an electricity between them, palpable and undeniable. You look different, Adrian murmured, his hand brushing Luka's side as they leaned against the wall. Luka swallowed hard. I feel different. Adrian stepped closer, his body heat enveloping Luka. In a good way, I hope. Luka closed the distance between them, his lips grazing Adrian's in a kiss that sent a shock of sensation through both of them. It wasn't slow or gentle. It was urgent, like they both needed more than just affection. They needed to feel. When they pulled apart, Luka couldn't look away from Adrian's dark eyes, his breath ragged. Why is this so hard? Adrian's voice was barely a whisper. Because it's worth it. Chapter 19. Underneath it all. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Luka tried to convince himself that he wasn't losing control, but every time Adrian touched him, smiled at him, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. They were back at Luka's place now, both silently acknowledging that this was their moment. I need you to be real with me, Luka said, his voice quiet but firm. Tell me what you want. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Luka, almost like he was deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I want you. All of you. Luka's heart skipped. I don't know how to give that. Adrian smiled, his fingers tracing Luka's jaw. I think you already have. Luka closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. He had no more excuses. No more running. Then stay with me, Adrian whispered. Stay with me, Luka. Luka's chest tightened. I don't know how to stop this. Adrian's lips met his, soft at first, but then deepening. It wasn't about sex. It was about commitment. About trusting each other in ways Luka had never done before. And for once, Luka was willing to trust. Chapter 20. The Choice. The air was thick with unspoken words when Luka walked into Adrian's apartment. He knew what was coming, knew it would be hard, but he couldn't stop it now. He was in too deep. Adrian was waiting for him, his expression unreadable. You know this isn't going to be easy, Adrian said, his voice quiet but firm. Luka nodded. I'm aware. Adrian stepped forward, his eyes searching Luka's face. Then why are we doing this? Luka swallowed. Because I don't want to regret it. Adrian's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand resting on Luka's chest. You won't. Luka's breath hitched. This was the moment. The moment where everything could either fall apart or become something more. Then let's make this real, Luka whispered. Adrian's lips found Luka's, and in that kiss, Luka understood. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Their choice. And for the first time, Luka didn't have to question it. Chapter 21. Tangled Hearts. The night air was cool, but Luka was burning from the inside out. He stood at Adrian's doorstep, his hand trembling as he knocked. He had spent the entire day battling with his thoughts, his heart, unsure if he was even capable of giving Adrian what he wanted. But here he was. He couldn't stay away. Adrian answered quickly, his expression soft but intense, his eyes locking onto Luka's like he could see through every defense. You're here, Adrian said, his voice low, almost as if it were a question. Luka didn't say anything at first, stepping inside and pulling Adrian toward him. The moment their bodies collided, it was like the world stopped. There was no past, no future, just the present, the heat between them, undeniable and fierce. I don't know how to be what you need, Luka confessed, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his words. But I know I can't walk away. Adrian didn't reply immediately. Instead, he cupped Luka's face, his thumb tracing Luka's lips. Then don't, he whispered. Stay with me. Let me show you how real we can be. Luka's heart hammered in his chest as Adrian kissed him, the sensation unlike anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't slow, it wasn't tentative, it was raw, desperate, and all-consuming. Luka melted into it, his body responding as if it had been waiting for this moment. Adrian's hands roamed over Luka's body, pressing him closer, making Luka's heart race even faster. Luka's hands gripped Adrian's shirt, pulling him down into a deeper kiss, their mouths melding in perfect synchronicity. But then, Luka pulled away, his chest heaving with urgency. What are we doing, Adrian? Adrian's voice was a whisper as he kissed Luka's forehead. We're doing what feels right. Luka closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words sink into him. He didn't know if it was right, but for the first time, he didn't care. Chapter 22. The Unraveling. The next morning, Luka woke in Adrian's arms, the faint light filtering through the blinds. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, but as he looked over at Adrian, still asleep beside him, his stomach twisted with uncertainty. What had happened last night wasn't just physical. It was more than that. They had crossed a line, and Luka wasn't sure if he was ready to face what that meant. Adrian stirred, his hand reaching out to pull Luka closer. You okay? He murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep. Luka hesitated before nodding. Yeah, just thinking. Adrian lifted his head, his eyes searching Luka's face. About us. Luka froze. The words were right there on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say them. Instead, he simply nodded. Adrian's hand trailed down Luka's back, sending a shiver through him. Whatever happens, Luka, we'll figure it out. Together. Luka's chest tightened at the sincerity in Adrian's voice. He wanted to believe it. He really did. But the fear of what it meant to be with Adrian, to give himself fully, was too much. I don't want to hurt you, Luka whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You already have, Adrian said softly, his hand brushing against Luka's cheek. "But I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." The vulnerability in Adrian's eyes made Luka's heart ache. There was no more denying the bond between them. It was real, and it was undeniable. But it terrified Luka. Adrian kissed him then, slow and deliberate, as if trying to show Luka everything he had to offer. The kiss deepened, and Luka's resolve started to crumble. His hands moved to Adrian's shoulders, pulling him closer, feeling the heat of Adrian's skin against his own. Luka didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending that this wasn't everything he'd ever wanted. Chapter 23. The Breaking Point. As the days wore on, the intensity of their connection only grew. Luka found himself caught in a whirlwind, pulled between what he wanted and what he feared. He tried to keep his distance, but every time Adrian was near, it was impossible to resist. One night, they found themselves alone again. The air was thick with tension as Luka stood in Adrian's apartment, his back pressed against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Adrian was close, too close, his hand resting just inches from Luka's waist. "Luka," Adrian's voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried with it a weight Luka could feel in his bones. "Adrian." Luka's voice cracked, his chest tightening as the need for Adrian became unbearable. Adrian moved forward, his lips brushing Luka's ear. "Tell me what you want." Luka's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't lie anymore. "I want you. I've always wanted you." Adrian's lips captured his in a kiss that was feverish, full of all the things they hadn't said. It was desperate, as if they both feared that the moment might slip away. Their bodies pressed together, the heat between them building to a point where Luka felt like he might explode. Adrian's hands roamed, pulling Luka's shirt over his head, exposing his bare skin to the cool air. But it wasn't enough. Luka needed more. Needed to feel everything. He yanked at Adrian's clothes, pulling them off as if he couldn't get them off fast enough. And when they were skin to skin, Luka didn't hold back. He kissed Adrian with the same hunger, the same desperate need. "Are you sure?" Adrian whispered, his hands stilled for just a moment, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Luka met his gaze, his breath ragged. "I'm sure." And just like that, their worlds collided. Chapter 24. The Reckoning. Luka lay sprawled across Adrian's bed, his body aching in ways he couldn't explain. Adrian's arms were around him, holding him close, as if trying to keep him grounded. But Luka's mind was a storm, his thoughts racing as he replayed the night over and over again. "Are you okay?" Adrian's voice was a soft murmur against Luka's ear. Luka didn't answer right away, trying to process everything he was feeling. He couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of rightness that had come with being with Adrian, but the intensity of their connection also terrified him. "I don't know what I'm doing," Luka admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Adrian tilted his head, his fingers brushing Luka's hair away from his forehead. "You're with me. That's all that matters." Luka's breath caught. "But what if it's not enough?" "It is enough," Adrian said, his lips brushing Luka's temple. "We'll make it enough. You and me." Luka closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to figure it out alone. And that was enough. Chapter 25. The Promise. Luka sat on the balcony, staring out over the city skyline, his mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. Adrian was inside, giving him space, but Luka knew what he had to do. When Adrian joined him, he didn't say anything at first. He simply stood beside Luka, watching the sunset. Luka took a deep breath, turning to face Adrian. "I can't keep running from this. From you." Adrian smiled softly, his eyes filled with tenderness. "I know." Luka's heart swelled as he took Adrian's hand, feeling the weight of their bond in the simple touch. "Let's stop pretending, Adrian. Let's make this real." Adrian's smile deepened, and he pulled Luka into his arms. "It's already real, Luka. And it always will be." In that moment, Luka realized that love, true love, wasn't just about passion or desire. It was about trust, commitment, and the courage to face the unknown together. And for the first time in his life, Luka was ready to face it.